So what we're looking at today is sketching gradient functions. So the gradient function is a function that will tell you what the slope or direction of an original function is. So let's have a look at the first one. So in question A, we're graphing the gradient function for this curve. So the very first thing that we want to look at is where is this curve going in a positive gradient or a negative gradient. So where it's going downwards in a left to right direction, that's negative. Where it's going upwards is positive. And then we also want to look at where it changes directions. On our gradient function, we're going to mark where our turning points are. So that's where our gradient is equal to 0 and where we've gone from a 0 to a negative gradient or a negative to a 0 gradient. And we can see here that that's at points x1, x2 and x3. Our values less than x1 have a negative gradient, and so you can see here on our gradient function that our gradient function will be less than 0. Between x1 and x2 on our original function, the gradient is positive, and so those values will always be greater than 0 because they are positive numbers. So in our gradient function, that goes above the x-axis where our y values are positive. Between x2 and x3, our gradient is negative, and so our gradient function will have values that are negative. And so the curve goes below the x-axis where y values are negative. And then for values greater than x3, our gradient in our function is positive. So again, our gradient function goes above the x-axis. Now if we have a look at question B, we can see that we have our turning points at x1 and x2. We have a positive gradient in the values less than x1, a negative gradient between x1 and x2, and a positive gradient above x2. So when we look at our gradient function, you can see that between x1 and x2, where the gradient is negative, it has gone below the x-axis, where the y values are negative. And for values below x1, where the gradient is positive, you can see our gradient function is in the positive. For the values above x2, we can see that the gradient in our original function is positive, and so the gradient function has gone above the x-axis where the y values are positive. I hope you found this video helpful.